Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Diane Sidebottom. I'm actually here as a guest speaker. I'm the Learning Director for Other Transactions and Grants from the Defense Acquisition University. So I'm here today to talk to you about OTs, and just so you know a little bit of my background, why I'm here at a DARPA talk. I actually used to work at DARPA for about 10 years in the General Counsel's office, starting in 1994, when we first started doing other transactions. And so I've lived through the evolution of them from the very beginning, and used to work for Rick Dunn, who was the General Counsel at the time, who actually created the OT Authority for DoD. So I've had a lot of historical experience watching OTs sort of create and evolve as time has gone on. So I'm here to give you a little primer on what OTs are all about. And then as I've been at DAU the last 8 months or so, I've come up with a list of 10 common myths that I seem to get phone calls about almost every week. And so I want to go through the myths and just dispel all of them so that everybody understands there's a lot of misconceptions about OTs and a lot of folks who've been told some things that are not actually true. So hopefully you'll leave here with a better understanding about how they actually work and what they're really suited for. So a little bit about other transactions, just some of the history about why we have the authority in the first place. I get a chuckle when people talk to me about this new authority, other transactions, because it's not actually new. It's actually based on a NASA authority that was created in 1958 that NASA's been using since it was created. And when DARPA and many of the other DoD R&D agencies have been investing in technology for many, many years, but starting in the early 1980s, started to see a shift in the way technology development was being done in the United States. You know, prior to the early 80s, there were two basic players in R&D investment. There were the universities, who were doing the vast majority of the work, or the government labs, and there was the government, specifically DoD, who were the ones who were creating a lot of the requirements, a lot of the need statements about the threats they were trying to thwart, and had a lot of the money. And so it was basically contained within those major players. But in the early 1980s, the R&D agencies and DoD started to see a shift. And there's no one thing you can point to say what started to cause that shift. I personally think it started to shift over when we started to realize that microchips could be made smaller and smaller and smaller as we started to have more technology development in that area. Because companies started to realize that people would want technology in their homes. Once it got small and portable and cheaper, people could afford to have a lot of this technology. Okay. Do you want to turn this one off? Okay. Technology difficulties here. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, feel like Dr. Phil now, but okay. So, and companies started to invest much more heavily in R&D themselves, and they were starting to identify their own requirements largely based on profit dollars. What do they see as potential products that they could sell to the private sector folks, to the average people like you and me, that we'd be willing to spend money for? And starting then, we started to see a lot of companies starting to refuse to do business with DoD. No longer did we have the big dollars that we used to, but also we started to be really a problem for them in terms of doing contracting with us. It's the most unnerving thing you've ever experienced as part of the government, when you hand someone a contract and you really need their stuff and they hand it back to you and say, yeah, we're not doing that. Because you're too problematic for us, you have a lot of bureaucracy, you know, you're just too much baggage for us to deal with, and we've got plenty of other we got plenty of other money sources and we don't need you. And so DoD can't force somebody to take a government contract, so we had to start looking at our traditional procurement process and figure out another way of doing business. And that's what really started the concept of OTs within DoD, is how can we start to do business in a different way that could attract these folks who had otherwise plenty of other places to find money and plenty of other avenues that they were going down in terms of technology development, to work with us and partner with us and see us as a viable business partner so that we could get access to not only their investments but their technology developments. And so that was part of the second acquisition reform revolution that came along within the government, which was in the mid-90s. And that's when we started to see the OT authorities being passed by Congress. First, the OTs for Research, and then the OTs for Prototype Authority. And now we're in the third round of acquisition reform, and we're starting to see this big resurgence again. And it's a bigger one this time because it's not just resident within the R&D agencies, but instead is also now being considered by a lot of operational organizations that never really utilized it before. So it's a much more now larger cross-cutting consideration for folks of these different kind of tools that they can utilize to go out and reach out to folks that may not ordinarily want to do business with the federal government. But we're also seeing some circumstances where people don't understand what OTs are really for and are starting to consider using them for things that they're actually not suited for. So as with any tool, we want to use the tool correctly. We have a lot of tools available to us, and we want to make sure that our situations that we're trying to address are actually being utilizing the right tools to get us there. So there's two basic other transaction authorities that we have in DoD. This is something that I discover a lot of folks don't really understand. There tends to be a hyper focus in many organizations on doing OTs for prototypes, but there's actually two different kinds, and we need to be aware of this so that we're utilizing the proper kind of other transactions when we're awarding our agreements. We're going to start to see a lot more oversight, I believe, from various folks, including GAO and some other folks. We want to make sure that we're using the authority properly. And each one of these authorities have different rules. And so we need to understand exactly which one is the best suited for our circumstances. So the first is 10 U.S.C. 2371. That was the first authority that DARPA was given in 1989 and then was given to the rest of the DoD in 1991. That is the OTs for research, also known as technology investment agreements. And we'll walk through what the statute says in just a second. But that was the first shot across the bow that we went through with Congress to get this new kind of tool that will enable us to go out and do research projects. That went so well that in FY94, Congress gave DARPA first, and then the services 2 years later, the OTs for Prototype Authority that allow us to go from the non-acquisition side of the house into the acquisition side of the house, where traditionally we would use FAR-based contracts, but enable us to have a different tool that will get us out from all of the rules and regulations associated with those kind of arrangements. So 10 U.S.C. 2371B was the second authority that was given. Now, how do you know the difference between the two? The way I always look at it is, if what I'm trying to do is push the state of the art, I want to see whether how I can make that next technology leap. I want to see how I get to the next stage, potentially, of the technology development. And in order to do that, I have to build a couple to test on to prove out my theories, but I don't ever intend to keep them. That's an OT for research or a technology investment agreement. If, on the other hand, what my goal is to build a prototype, one or more, that I want to take into inventory at the end of all of this and give it to the soldiers, sailors, airmen to play with and see whether or not it's a viable technology for them that we might want to pursue. And in order to do that, I have to do a whole bunch of research to get me to that point. That's an OT for prototype. I'm seeing a lot of OTs for prototypes right now that should be OTs for research. We want to make sure we use the right authority. So what's the difference between the two authorities? The first one is also called Technology Investment Agreements by DoD. It allows the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the Military Departments to enter into transactions other than, in case you were wondering why we call them other transactions, that's why. Transactions other than, not exactly very creative English writing, I'll give you, but that's where the name came from. And OTs are defined in the negative. So I can tell you what they are not, but I can't tell you what they are. What they are not are procurement contracts, grants, or cooperative agreements. What they are is a whole universe of other possibilities that we're still exploring. So it could be a host of other kinds of arrangements, other kinds of contractual agreements that is left open to us to try and see what is necessary for our individual circumstances. But because they are not procurement contracts, grants, or cooperative agreements, all of the authorities relating to acquisition within DoD are generally gone away for OTs. So for OTs, there is no FAR, there is no DFARs, there are no agency-specific regulations, acquisition regulations. That alleviates from a lot of the baggage that comes with our traditional procurement process. Because once you get rid of all of the clauses associated with the FAR, once you get rid of things like the Competition and Contracting Act and TINA and all of those other sort of baggage kind of statutes that make us do our processes in such a structured way and make them take a long time, that leaves open now for the department to structure its acquisition process in a way that makes sense and that would be attractive to non-traditional performers, which is what the goal of this authority is to do, is to attract those kinds of folks. Now, this original authority was also more on the non-acquisition side, in that we weren't trying to buy anything we were going to bring into the inventory generally, but we were going to do basic, applied, and advanced research projects. So much more on the R side of R&D than the D side. Now this authority also was originally created to be a dual-use authority. The idea here was we were trying to utilize what industry was already doing, the new ideas they already had, the technologies they were already developing, and partner with them and roll our money in with their money to take this particular technology or product so that it could be utilized by both the military and the civilian markets. And so that's why there's a cost-sharing requirement in this original authority. It says the funds provided by the government should not exceed the funds provided by the other parties. So as a default position going in, a 50-50 cost share. Now, I think that's what hangs up a lot of folks from using this authority because they think it's a hard and fast 50-50, but it's not. Read the first part of the sentence. To the extent deemed practicable. That's lawyer speak for whatever seems reasonable at the time. It gives us a lot of flexibility to look at our individual situations and see what is reasonable considering the circumstances, considering things like prior investment in the commercial market and a few other things to see what should be expected from the teams. So what we're really looking for in this authority is commitment. Some sort of commitment, some sort of skin in the game from the offerors as to their dedication to take this technology and actually take it over the valley of death and into making it a product. And so the cost share is not necessarily a hard and fast, don't get hung up on that, but it's one that if you can make the case, and as the government we can make the case, that what you're putting up actually shows true commitment, then we can still go ahead and do this agreement even without a 50-50 cost share. Now, the flip side of this authority is the Other Transactions for Prototype authority, which came along a few years later. Now, in this particular authority, it allows us to use what we had in the first authority, but extend it into carrying out prototype projects. So prototype projects that are directly relevant to enhancing the mission effectiveness of military personnel, and I'll let you read the whole rest of the language without reading it to you. This is a bit of a change from what traditionally the OTS for Prototype Authority has said. It changed in FY15 to this language that you see here, but if any of you had been involved in older OTs, you'll remember that the authority used to say projects that were directly relevant to weapons or weapon systems proposed to be acquired by the Department of Defense. That always seemed to hang a lot of folks up who got a little too literal, and weapons seemed to be a word they had a hard time getting over, even though at DARPA we always thought that directly relevant to a weapon pretty much encompassed everything that DoD did, because as we know, what do many of the services consider to be the ultimate weapon? The soldier, or the sailor, or the airman. What's not directly relevant to them. But in recognition of the fact a lot of people had trouble with the weapon word, this new language was included in the statute in FY15 that now gives a much more broad statement of what we can use the OTs for prototypes for. And so this authority is given directly to the director of DARPA, the secretaries of the military departments, and the SecDef. And so for many of you who are involved with the military departments, they already have the authority. They just have to delegate it downward. That's dependent on their own structure. And then the defense agencies have to go and ask for the authority from OSD, which is not generally a difficult process. It just takes a little bit of time. So a lot of agencies have, and more are doing it daily. And so this will be something that I think you'll see a much broader spectrum of folks that will be able to do OTs for prototypes, especially in this new go-round of acquisition reform that we're running across. So with OTs for prototypes, though, there's a few more rules than there is for the research type. The research type make no mention of who has to be on your team. Your team can be constructed of whomever you like. But the OTs for prototypes do want more of a focus on what truly OTs were created to do, and that was to attract non-traditional performers. So listed in the statute are 4 different considerations that must exist on the performer team. Now this is not an and list, this is an or list, so you just have to hit one of the boxes, not all of them. And it's not a hierarchy, but it does show, since this is how it's listed in the statute, what's most important to Congress in terms of what this authority is all about. And that is having at least one non-traditional defense contractor or a nonprofit research institution participating to a significant extent on your team. If you don't have that, one of the other considerations is having all of the significant participants in the transaction being small businesses or non-traditional defense contractors. It's not that much of a difference between the first and the second, but what really wanted to be emphasized in that second one was the small business aspect of it. Congress wanted us to focus on small businesses, as they always do, and trying to promote the small business participation in OTs. One thing that did change in FY18 was it does now allow for OTs to be used for SBIR awards. Now this is something that had been debated for many years. DARPA always thought you could, others did not agree. Congress agreed with DARPA and stuck in that language. And so now as an SBIR awardee, you can choose between, potentially, depending on the agency you're working with, an OT4 Prototype or a procurement contract. And that is something that I think you'll start to see in the next year or so being much more widely used for SBIRs. Now, if you don't have either of the two categories fulfilled, and you're a traditional defense contractor, then you're going to have to put up at least 1/3 of the total cost of the prototype project. The money has to come from somebody other than the federal government, so either your team members or someone else. And that authority was, or that requirement was put into the OT statute much later than when it was passed. In the original statute, that cost share requirement was never there because this authority was always intended to be for purely military items. And how would you as a company recover that investment if your business base is only the government? And there wasn't a realistic expectation that people would invest like that. But about 8 or so years into the government using OTs, Congress took a look at the projects we were doing and noticed that a lot of the participants were traditional defense contractors. And their argument to us was, why are you giving them OTs? They're traditional defense contractors, just give them a contract. They'll be willing to take it, a traditional procurement contract. What they didn't see was that even though many of the primes were traditional defense contractors, there were a lot of non-traditional subcontractors at the sub-tier level, but that's not often how these contracts are reported, so they didn't see that part of it. And so as an effort to force, basically, traditional defense contractors to go out and find non-traditional performers or non-profit research institutions to work with, they included that third cost share as basically a penalty. If you don't go out and find a widely diverse team that would include non-traditionals, then you're going to have to put up at least 1/3 of the total cost of the program. And that is a hard and fast 1/3 because it's defined by statute. And so that is why we're always trying to encourage even the traditional defense contractors to behave a little bit differently, to go out and look for a broader base of sub-tier members or partners so that we don't have you put up the third. That's not what we're looking for in any way, shape, or form. We want you to instead find these partners so that you can not only work with them on this project, but hopefully continue to work with them on future projects and get us that bigger defense industrial base. If neither of the three categories are satisfied, then the agency SPE, which is a senior procurement executive or senior acquisition executive, can waive all of the requirements and just let us do an OT even though we don't have any of the others. I can tell you in almost 30 years of doing OTs, as far as I know, the waiver has never happened by any agency. And I think it's because the other categories are easy enough to fulfill, and that is our goal anyway, is to go out and find those non-traditionals, so we end up doing that most of the time. Who's to say? We may see a waiver come along at some point. I don't think we ever will, but it's always there just in case. Now, who is a non-traditional defense contractor? That's always key in this environment, especially for those of you who work in the private sector, to know whether you fit within this category. Now, this definition, too, changed fairly dramatically in FY16. So I'll compare and contrast what we used to have to what we have now and why this is so much different. So this definition is not actually found in the OT language itself. I've given you the statutory citation so you can find it. It is a separate definition that's in another part of the U.S. Code. And it now says that a non-traditional defense contractor is an entity that is not performed or is not performing in the last year a contract or subcontract for DoD that is subject to full CAS coverage. CAS is the cost accounting standards, which is generally considered to be $50 million in government contracts in the aggregate in the last year, or a single $50 million contract. That is a very higher threshold than what we had had in the past. Up until FY16, the language had read subject to full CAS coverage or had a contract or subcontract that was required to submit certified cost and pricing data. That was the truth in negotiations threshold, which was about $750,000. So that was very low, too low in many ways, which would often catch people and turn them into traditionals, folks like SBIR Phase 2 awardees, who would get more than $750,000. So one of the things DoD went back to do is push Congress to raise that threshold. They just raised it a lot higher than we were expecting by basically just lopping off the end of the sentence. So full cast coverage now is what we're looking at. When you consider that definition, all small businesses, if you fall under a NAICS code legitimately, you will be a non-traditional defense contractor because small businesses are not subject to full cast coverage. And so you'll fit in this definition as well, which makes you very attractive to the large defense contractors who are looking for partners. It also says any contractor subcontract. That would be procurement contract. That is not a grant, not a cooperative agreement, and not another OT. So we'll be looking for those procurement contracts in that $50 million range as to what is going to bind you and make you a traditional. Also, another thing that changed in FY16 that's fairly significant is the statute used to read any contract or subcontract for the federal government that is subject to full cast coverage, and Congress changed it in FY16 to DoD, which actually makes sense, but because we're talking about non-traditional defense contractors. But changing from federal government to DoD means you also eliminate all civilian agency contracts from consideration as well. It's only contracts and subcontracts for DoD. That also broadens the base of potential folks who would fit within this category. And so personally, I don't think we'll see a lot of cost share again for OTs for prototypes, largely because the definition is now big, it's broad enough that most of the big traditional defense contractors should be able to go out and find non-traditional folks who fit within this definition to partner with. And I'll be honest with you, my personal opinion is, if you can't go out and find somebody that fits in that definition, I don't want you. And I'm not going to give you an OT because the whole goal of the authority is to have you do that. I don't want your cost share. Nobody in DoD wants your cost share in this environment. We instead want you to go out there and try to fulfill the goals of the statute. So less and less opportunities or requirements for most everyone to have to put up the third. Now, one thing that's gotten everybody excited in the last couple years is the inclusion of the potential for you to take your OT for Prototype agreement and segue it into the production end of things. So in the original statute, the OT for Prototype authority had to have your agreement end at LRIP. LRIP was limited rate initial production. It was intended only for the R&D phase. And when you reached the LRIP stage, you had to end your agreement and then go off and do a traditional procurement contract for the remainder of it. This created some artificial difficulties, like big gaps where you had to go back out and recompete potentially, or do JNAs for sole source agreements, and it created a difficulty in the flow of your programs. And so, about 10 years ago, actually, they included language that allowed for a follow-on OT from an OT for Prototype. But the way the language was written, it was so strange that no one could actually do it. What had said before was, you could go ahead and you could move from an OT for Prototype into an OT for production, but you had to negotiate at the time of award of the OT for Prototype how many you wanted to buy in production and how much they would cost acquisition costs. Now, this is for something that's a prototype that you haven't actually made yet, and you're not sure it's going to work or what it's really going to look like. What's the likelihood that you can put a cost on it and you know exactly how many you want to buy? It's ridiculous. So no one did it. It just sort of sat there in the statute and just was never used. Well, Congress was wondering why no one was using it, took a look at it, realized it was basically unworkable, and in FY16 changed the language to give us what we see today, which is easier to use, but in some way equally as difficult because it's kind of vague. So we're going to have a lot of folks who are going to be pioneers trying this out and seeing how this is going to go before we finally get some common practical ways of doing this in such a way that is going to make sense. So now the statute says that, and this is key, you have to have started your project as an OT for Prototype in order for you to utilize this follow-on production authority. I'm getting a lot of calls from folks who have existing procurement contract R&D programs, FAR-based, that want to now take those and go into OTs for production. It's not going to work. The authority says it has to begin as an OT for Prototype first if you want to have this option of going into an OT for production. And the advantage of this authority is now, regardless of the vehicle you choose for production, you do not have to recompete the production decision. You can go seamlessly from prototype into production with a variety of different vehicles you can choose from, but the original competition is considered sufficient for that decision as well. So the statute says in order to utilize this, the follow-on effort going into production has to be awarded to the same parties that the prototype agreement was awarded to. So depending on how you've chosen to structure yourself as a team, this is going to make a difference as to who is going to be able to get that award. If you had structured your prototype agreement as a prime-sub kind of relationship, that means that the OT for production, or whatever vehicle you choose, has to go to that same prime, which may or may not be the optimal situation. But if you don't go to the same person, then you're going to have, this is not going to be an option for you, and you're going to have to go back out the traditional way and go through the traditional procurement process. For those of you who may be involved in Consortia OT that are very popular right now, these are basically task order, delivery order, other transactions that allow for large groups of people to come together and orders then are placed by the government. That traditionally, those agreements are given to the consortia management firm, who is not a technical person and would not want to get the follow-on. So Congress has allowed in the statute for the follow-on production agreement or contract to go to the sub-awardee, the team member who actually has done the technical work under the consortia agreement and eliminated the consortia management firm as being a party in all of this. And so that is one exemption that has been made for those kind of arrangements. Also, the Competition and Contracting Act does not apply to OTs, so we are not required to go out and do full and open competition. We're not required to do sole source justifications. We don't have the same kind of restrictions on all of that sort of thing, but both statutes say we're supposed to use competitive procedures to the maximum extent practicable. The difference is now we're not dictated the kind of competition we have to have. We can create our own versions of what is effective competition. But you can also do a sole source OT. There's nothing in the statute that says you can't. Personally, I never would, given my druthers, just because, again, what is our goal here? It's to go out and put out as broad an offering as we can, trying to get in those non-traditionals. But if you did go sole source, the statute says in order to do the follow-on, you had to have competitively awarded the OT for prototype before, if you want to take this action to go non-competitively into production. So if you did a sole source award for an OT for prototype, this option is not available to you. Again, trying to encourage us to push us towards being competitive at all stages. And again, that makes sense because why should you be able to carry somebody non-competitively into production that was non-competitively put into the prototype? And then finally, your prototype phase has to be successfully completed. What this was always intended to sort of cover was, why would you go into production with an unsuccessful prototype? That would sort of seem self-defeating. But what has happened is GAO has gotten involved in this. There was a GAO protest for the very first OT for prototype award. GAO very rarely ever gets involved in OTs. They have a very limited jurisdiction. All they will look to see is whether or not you've chosen the right instrument if you have a choice, which is why they ended up getting involved in this, because as you'll see, you have a choice of instruments. What GAO found for the protester. Now what had happened was it was an OT that was competitively awarded for cloud computing services, and it was then given as a sole source in the follow-on. But what had happened with that particular situation was the production agreement for one of the tasks in the original OT for prototype was awarded before the OT for prototype agreement itself had been completed. And what GAO said was that third category wasn't satisfied because the prototype phase wasn't finished. A very easy fix. It's a timing issue more than anything else. To be fair to the agency that awarded that agreement, they had 2 tasks going on in their prototype agreement, and one task was finished. It's just the other one wasn't yet, so the agreement had not ended. And they awarded the production agreement for the task that was finished. GAO didn't like that, so what we'll have to do from now on is the prototype agreement will have to end before we can award the follow-on production agreement. Again, not rocket science, not going to affect too many folks, but it's something we'll have to be watchful of. The other thing that GAO said was the reason why they sustained the protest was the original OT for prototype solicitation did not mention anywhere that the follow-on production phase might be given non-competitively. Now, to be fair to them, That original solicitation was issued before this authority came out, so they wouldn't have known to say it. And there's nothing in there that said they had to have said it. But GAO felt that it was unfair to offerors not to have that knowledge that if they don't get in at the prototype stage, they will be locked out for the production stage. Now, this is something that DARPA has always tried to do, which is be as open and as transparent as possible with OTs and tell you every possible knowledge that we have about how the agreement's going to go and what we're anticipating. But this is something that we'll have to be careful of as a group across DoD now from this point forward. So now what agencies will need to do is say in their solicitation for the prototype agreement that there is a possibility, an intention, a plan, some sort of language like that, that the agency may go into production without further competition. So from a contractor perspective, what does that tell you? Get in now, get in on the prototype end of things, because you may not get another shot to participate if you don't do that. And so when they make the decision to go from the OT4 Prototype into production, the agency has several choices of vehicles that it can choose from. The statute is silent on this, but I believe you can do this. You could just extend the original OT4 Prototype and just add on another phase for production. That might have some advantages, but it might have some distinct disadvantages as well, because I think the prototype agreements are going to look vastly different than the production agreements will look very, very different from the prototype agreements. You could, and what most people will probably do, is end the prototype agreement and then enter into a new OT for production. Disadvantages and advantages with that approach as well, but they'll have to decide which wins out. Or, as an agency, you could decide to end the prototype agreement and award a procurement contract. But if you award a procurement contract, you still don't have to recompete it. So you will not have to go through the whole justification and approval process and the notification process. And so regardless of the vehicle, that original competition will be sufficient in theory. And that is one thing that I personally think we may see a protest about again. And there's probably going to be more protests about this decision than we've seen in the past because, as many of you know, not a lot of money to be made in R&D, but a lot of money to be made in production. Right? And so that usually was what often drives people to protest if they don't win. And so I think one of the things we potentially will see a protest on is what is sufficient competition in this environment. And that's never been addressed before because we've never had this kind of decision to make. We'll have to wait and see what GAO thinks. And so, or any other procedure that the SecDef may come up with. It would not be considered sole source at that point because that original competition will have been sufficient. So, if you are a contractor, you want to watch for that language in the agreement, make sure that you see, or in the solicitation, and make sure that you see it there, and that gives you the notice that you need, that you may not get another chance. So if you want in, now's the time to get in, or you may not get that opportunity again. Okay, so let's address the myths. So about 2 months ago, I started to see a trend of misconceptions about OTs as I was at DAU. And so I made a list of the top 10 myths that I'm seeing, and I'm going to summarily squash each one of them so that everybody is clear on exactly what this authority is for. So the first one, and it's one I've already mentioned, is that there's only one type of OT. Everyone seems to gravitate towards OTs for prototypes, but there's two different kinds, and because there's two different kinds, we need to understand exactly what we're trying to do before we pick our vehicle. This is a very common thing that DoD does, is pick the vehicle it wants to award and then try to shove its problem into it to make it work. Instead, what we should be doing is seeing what it is that we're trying to achieve. What's our end state that we're trying to get to? What is it that we hope to end up with at the end of all of this? And then see what the appropriate vehicle is. And I think many OTs for prototypes right now should be OTs for research because that's really what they're trying to do. Also, if I must get probably one call a day from folks saying, I want to do OTs because they're fast. I don't know where this is coming from, but let me summarily squash that right here. They can be fast, but the problem is not the vehicle when it comes to speed. The problem is the process. And changing your vehicle is not going to help matters if you don't change your internal process as an agency. So if you did an OT, but you still made it go through your whole Part 15 source selection process with clarifications and competitive ranges and discussions and all that, and then you send it through your same chop chain that you use for contracts that has to go through 10 or 15 or 20 people, is this going to be any faster than what you're experiencing now? No, it's not. It's not the vehicle that's the problem. FAR-based contracts should be a whole lot faster than they are. Instead, what OTs do allow you to do is change your process if you embrace the flexibility. But the main goal of OTs is to find non-traditional performers. And if that is not what you're after as well, then OTs are not the right vehicle for you. There's other authorities out there that allow you to go fast if that's your main goal. This can be faster, but won't necessarily be any faster if you don't change the way you're doing business. Also, I get a lot of folks who are very confused about whether OTs are actually contracts. Yes, from a legal perspective, and I am a lawyer, so I can attest to this, OTs are contracts in that they fulfill all 6 legal elements of a contract. They are binding legal arrangements between 2 parties where consideration flows back and forth. We call them agreements because if we called them contracts, everybody in the government would immediately go to procurement contracts, which is a subset of contracts, and procurement contracts are governed by the FAR. And so this is an argument that I used to have a lot with government folks. Grants are contracts. They're just not procurement contracts that are governed by those rules and regulations that we're accustomed to be using. One of the things that you will notice in the OT world is that the names of everything has been changed from what you're used to seeing in the FAR-based world. This is not an accident. This is a wholesale exercise we used to go through in the early days of OTs, is change the names of everything, because we didn't want anyone to hear a name and automatically think they knew what it meant. So for instance, I would never call a solicitation for an OT an RFP. There's nothing wrong with RFP. It's request for proposal is a very generic phrase. But when I say RFP, what do you think? Those of you who are used to traditional procurement contracting automatically go to Part 15 and start thinking you know what the rules are and how it has to go, right? And so don't think that this is an accident that all these names are different. This was on purpose so that people would start to think differently and understand that we are not using the same old rules, but in fact are trying to do something a little bit different. But it is still a contract. It still needs an agreements officer who will need an agreements officer warrant from the government to sign it. That doesn't change anything, but it is just not, we're just not calling it a contract because of the connotation that people have with that term. Now, again, OTs will always be faster. No. In fact, many people are often disappointed when they choose to do an OT and then find out that not only is it not faster, sometimes it's slower. And why might it be slower? Well, one, it's going to look weird. And if you are in an agency that's never done them before, everyone in your chain is going to look at this and go, what the heck is this? And it's going to sit on their desk for a while because they're not sure what it's all about and want to have a lot of conversations about it. So that may slow up the process. The other difficulty that you may have is that when you get rid of the FAR, you also get rid of Part 52, which is all of the clauses that you're used to seeing in your FAR-based contract. Now you're starting from a plain sheet of paper like you would be if you were in the commercial world, and you're going to have to negotiate the clauses in this contract. How many contracting officers in the government are really that adept at negotiating clauses in contracts? We don't do that in the government, right? We do contracting by regulation. The only things we negotiate in our contracts in the traditional procurement sense is rates and statement of work. Now, instead, we're going to have to negotiate all of the terms and conditions as well, and that's going to take a learning curve till people get used to that, doing that, and get comfortable with coming up with those terms and conditions. So it can, in fact, take a little bit longer. And if you're a traditional procurement contractor, a traditional defense contractor, it can take equally as long for you as well because you're used to seeing all those clauses too, and you're going to have to think a little bit differently as well. Anyone in DoD can award an OT? No, not necessarily. If you're in a military department, you have the authority, but who knows how far down it's been delegated. You have to check and see whether it's been delegated down to your level and whether or not you can make this decision for yourself. If you're in a defense agency, you have to check and see if it's been delegated to you at all. If it hasn't, then you have to go and ask for the delegation from OSD. So not everybody in DoD is going to be able to award OTs today. They have to see whether or not the authority's been delegated to them before they make that call. The next bullet is one I get a lot of calls about as well. This is a substitute for the FAR. No, it is not. I must get one call a week from folks saying, I want to award an OT for support contractor services. No, you don't, because that is not what this is about. What is prototype or researchy about support contractor services? unless you're going to experiment on them, which I'm hoping you're not, because that's generally frowned upon. There's nothing researchy about that. That's what the FAR was written to buy, or those kind of normal operational maintenance, everyday kind of services that you need to run your agency. I also get a call a week for somebody who wants to buy computers for their office using OTs because they're fast. No, you're not. If you just want to go out to Dell and buy a bunch of computers, that's what the FAR was written to buy. That's the kind of things that the FAR was really suited to do. That is not what this is suited for. So remember, at its heart, this is an R&D authority until you get to the production stage. This is intended for research and prototypes. It is not intended for those everyday kind of buys that you want to do, keep your agency open and running. There are some folks out there who are sort of touting it as being a substitute for the FAR. It is not there yet. Instead, it does have its limitations, and you have to understand what those are. So I've been seeing a lot of articles written about OTs, and they're mostly critical of OTs, because they say, well, when you take away the FAR, there's no statutes or regulations that apply, and now people can just run amok. What is the chances that there would be no statutes or regulations that would apply to something the government does? Slim to none, okay? What the OTs do is take away the acquisition regulations and statutes. So basically what it does is eliminate most everything in the Armed Services Procurement Act, which is the basis for the FAR. What it doesn't eliminate is all the other statutes and regulations that cover other aspects of the way we do business. So for instance, appropriations rules don't change for OTs. That's about funding, that's not about acquisition. Color of money, timing of money, Anti-Deficiency Act, all of that sort of thing is still going to be the same because the vehicle doesn't change how we approach the money. So we are still going to be subject to those rules. Also, rules that apply because you live in America are still going to apply to you. You're just not going to see them in your agreement anymore. One of the things we tried to do with OTs was strip out all of the references to laws that you have to follow because you live and do business in the United States. So, for instance, do I have to tell you in your contract that you have to pay people minimum wage? No, that's a law. It's a labor law that you have to fulfill because you do business in the United States. The fact it's not in your contract doesn't make you not have to do it. It just means I'm not talking about it. Same way with things like employing convicts or children. Also, just because your agreement doesn't talk about it means you can have a whole bunch of children at your facility. Environmental laws. Just because I don't mention clean water doesn't mean you can dump sewage down the drain. You still have to follow that because that's an EPA law that's going to apply to you because you do business in America. You're also going to see some of those social aspect laws, things like the Civil Rights Act and a few of those sorts of things obviously still apply. We can't discriminate. That has nothing to do with the contract. And the one that I always find really funny is how many people I get calls from who think that the criminal laws don't apply to them because they're not in their agreement. Used to get a lot of calls in the early days, no offense to the people from California, from folks in California, very excited because the drug-free workplace clause wasn't in their OT. And I would catch on after speaking to them for a while as to why they're excited about this. And I'd have to say, just because it doesn't say that you can't do drugs doesn't mean you can. It just means you don't have to post the posters anymore about why drugs are bad. They're like, but it doesn't say it says that doesn't say I have to be drug-free. I'm like, I know, but that's not my rule. That's a crime. So you have to follow those because you live here. So you don't get off the hook for crimes even if I don't talk about them in my agreement. They're still going to apply to you. So there are still going to be rules and regulations that we're going to have to follow. There is some baggage that the government can't shake off because it is the government. So things like having to be able to terminate our contracts if we run out of money. We have to be able to do that even though that's not a commercial practice. And some of those other things. But we're going to try to behave as much like a commercial company as we can or a commercial partner to give you the flexibility that you will need in order to do business with us. Now, as I mentioned, the Competition and Contracting Act does not apply to OTs, but that doesn't mean that we can just go out and award sole source all the time. Both statutes say that we are supposed to be competitive to the maximum extent practicable. Again, the wiggle words. But it does focus us on competition, and competition is a good thing, right? Keeps prices low, keeps quality high, it gives us leverage in negotiation. It's not something we want to avoid. We just don't have to do it the way the FAR does it. And so it gives the agencies the ability to structure their own competitive process. But with that, and the fact that we are still the stewards of the taxpayer dollars in the government, we still do want to be as fair as possible. We don't want to give people unfair competitive advantage. We also want to be as transparent as we can be, because we're trying to build relationships with the non-traditional folks out there in the commercial world who generally think of us as bad business partners. So we don't want to avoid any of that. It's just we don't have to run a competition the way the traditional procurement world would make us run a competition. So that's a criticism I see a lot as well of OTs, is that people can just pick their favorite people all the time. That is not how it is supposed to work, and that is not what the intention is. And so hopefully you're not seeing that very often. Okay, this is one I see a lot of as well. There have been a lot of talk and a lot of proliferation of these consortia OTs that are being run like basically like IDIQ contracts, task order and delivery order contracts. That is a business model that some people are adopting that has absolutely nothing to do with OTs. You could do that same model with procurement contracts. That's just how they've chosen to construct their business arrangement with the folks that they're dealing with. You do not have to use a consortia in order to award an OT. You can award, the agencies can award OTs on their own, issue their own solicitations, go out there and run their own competitions. That is certainly not a requirement. And so don't believe that you have to join a consortia necessarily in order for an agency to give you another transaction. And more agencies are starting to run their own competitions as they're realizing that they can do them just as fast if they do them properly. So these are all just different business arrangements that we have available to us. Any one of them will work for us. We're not constrained by any of them. And then finally, the OT authorities are not new. I get that a lot from folks. Oh, this new thing. It's not new. By the way, none of these authorities that you see are coming along recently are new. You heard a lot about rapid prototyping and rapid fielding. That's not new either. That's a regurgitation of a project we did 20 years ago as well. If you stay in the government long enough, you sort of see a cycle of things that just come back around with new names attached to them. So that's why they look new. It also has not been rarely used. Where it has not been used much is outside of the R&D world. The R&D agencies within DoD, you know, the ONRs, the AFRLs, the AFOSRs, the Army Research Office, DARPA, have been using OTs since they began and have never stopped. What is new now is how many of the operational organizations are starting to look to them to do some of their developmental projects, and largely because of the ability to take them into production if they should be successful. So we have a sort of a group of folks who are new to the game, and then folks who have been doing this for quite a long time. But there is a lot of lessons learned. There is a lot of best practices that are out there, and we're trying to share those. That's one reason why I'm at DAU, is try to educate folks about some things that have gone well, some things that have not. But none of this is, there's not a lot of guidance out about OTs on purpose, because we wanted to leave as much flexibility to the agencies as possible to address the situations that they're going to run across. And so there are going to be some hiccups for some folks as they go along, but there is a lot of experiential basis out there already for doing OTs. And I can tell you, OTs have been audited many, many times. DARPA had GAO living with us for about 4 years when we first started doing OTs. There has not been a case of fraud, waste, and abuse ever found in an OT. Cross fingers, we'll keep that record going with everybody trying to use them. And so we are trying to make sure that the folks who are new to using them are getting educated by some of the folks who've used them for quite a long time. But they've been around forever. It's not, or for the last 30 years. It's not something that is going to be that much of a surprise to anyone. And Congress has been aware of them for that long as well. So just in conclusion, just to reiterate, this is one tool amongst many. And even though I'm an OT fanatic in many ways, I don't think it's appropriate for every situation. What you should be doing, and what we should be doing on both sides, is looking to see what it is we're trying to achieve and then picking the appropriate tool that's going to get the optimal path to get us to that point. And OTs might be that path, but it could be something else as well. We need to make sure that we're using it properly. It is not the right choice in all circumstances. And so if you're an agent, or you're working with an agency that doesn't traditionally do any kind of R&D or development, this is probably not something you'll see too much, because they shouldn't be using it for those normal kind of operations and maintenance kind of activities. But the real goal of all of this has been and always will be to attract non-traditional performers and small businesses, to try to get in those folks that traditionally have shied away from dealing with the government because they either have too much baggage or they're too difficult to work with, to free up all of that difficulty for you so that we can work with you as a partner and allow you to use your own existing business processes without forcing you to go and rejoin yourself into something that the government is familiar with. And then finally, these can go fast. DARPA can do them quite quickly because DARPA's been doing them for a long time. But not a lot of agencies will necessarily find that they can be as speedy as other agencies if they have a lot of bureaucracy internally or they don't change the process that they're doing. So if you're an agency that's looking to do OT solely because you think you're going to be able to do them a whole lot faster, the only way you're going to be able to do that is basically break them out of your existing process and create a parallel track that's all new and open and is doing something much different than what you've traditionally done. Again, there is a learning curve with doing OTs. The more you do them, the better you will get, the easier they will be. But that's going to take a little bit of time as well. So don't expect the first one to go as smoothly as the 10th one that you do. Also, I would encourage any agencies in the room who are thinking about OTs, pick a small one first. No one is listening to me about this. Pick a small one. And by small, I mean hopefully under $100 million, because you can keep that decision in-house. Because it's going to be difficult and there's going to be some hiccups with trying a new way of doing business. Picking a $1 billion program and then doing a new way of doing business on top of it is sort of guaranteeing you to either end up in the front page of the Washington Post, or Congress looking at you funny. So try to pick a small one, cut your teeth on a relatively less complex one so that you can learn from this process and build up your expertise before you start addressing major weapon system programs or billion-dollar programs. But I know most of the agencies won't listen to me on this, but at least I said it so people will know. All right, so that's all I had. I think we have a few questions.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. What does significant extent mean for non-traditional contractors, or what is meant by all significant participants?
Okay, so significant extent has never been defined, ever, on purpose. It's always been left open to interpretation. And there is an OT4 Prototype guide that's been issued by OSD. When you go to look for it, make sure that you look for the 2017 version, because a lot of search engines bring up the older version, which is way out of date. In there, they give you some ideas of indices of what you're looking for. Now, the non-traditional performer does not have to be the prime if you're in a prime sub situation. It just has to be a member of the performing team who is doing something that is on the critical path. So in other words, their participation is causing a material reduction in cost or schedule or a material increase in performance. The way I like to look at it is, would the program be that much better with their participation? Are they bringing something to the table that really makes it that much more efficient, lowers the cost, and makes the program work along that much more quickly? Don't focus on how much money the non-traditional is getting, because that's not an issue. And it's not like a set-aside where they have to get at least 51% of the work or something like that. Instead, what we're looking to is, are you bringing something either on the critical path or new or important to the program, whether it's a process or a component or some key technology that is going to make the program that much better because of your participation there. Now, it is important to know, though, you have to identify the non-traditional at the time of award of the OT, because otherwise you're in the third cost share category, right? But the non-traditional person or people do not have to necessarily start work the moment the agreement's awarded. Because as many of you know, if you're doing a complex program, you may have folks that will come in a few months down the road when their participation is necessary, nor does the non-traditional have to stay with the program the entire time, right? Sometimes people will come in, do their thing, it's really important to the program, but once their part is over, they move on. That's okay, as long as they've been identified at the time of award and they actually come in and do what they're supposed to be doing. But significant participation is very much an agency decision, but most of the agencies will put the onus on the performers because you know your solution better than the agency does, right? Remember, this is, when they go out with these kind of solicitations, they're usually very broad-based, telling you more of a performance-based kind of approach than a design-based kind of approach, where I tell you what my problem space is and what I need to have solved, and then you come back to me with your solution. Who's going to know your solution better than you? So most solicitations will ask the performing teams to define in their proposals who their non-traditionals are, why you believe they're non-traditional based on that definition, and then what are they bringing to the table that is significantly important to your program. And so just be prepared to make that argument, and then from that, we'll take a look at it and negotiate it as a team, government and performer, to come up with something that we all agree is satisfactory. Now, as to the other one was about all small businesses.
No, all significant participants.
Yeah, that one is an odd one. No one's really used it much, just because if you have the first one, you kind of defeat the second one, right? If you have at least one non-traditional, then the second one doesn't really make any sense anymore. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Focus on the first one more, having at least one non-traditional, which, as we know, is also a small business potentially, or a nonprofit research institution. Now, if you were to have a team composed entirely of small businesses, obviously that's great, right? Then all the significant participants would be there. But it's kind of a dichotomy of the two, because if you have the one, you have the other, and kind of back and forth. So if you can satisfy the first scenario, which you will be if you have at least one, then you'll have satisfied the other one as well.
Yeah, can I ask a follow-on question to that, Diane? So we had questions about universities, whether they meet the definition of nonprofit research institution. And then on top of that, if they do meet that definition, which do they?
They could,
Okay,
depending on the
if
circumstances.
they are a not-for-profit
Yes.
university, then they would be they'd be a nonprofit research institution, which is part of the 2371B, right?
They would have to have an independent research agenda that they're pursuing, separate and distinct from this agreement, I believe.
Right.
That actually is not defined anywhere in the statute, but that
Okay.
makes sense.
So let's say that nonprofit research institutions and small businesses then are non-traditionals or meet that requirement. What if they have accepted CAS compliant contracts? Do they fall out of that definition, or are they covered?
Yeah. Okay, so this has actually not come up with anybody yet, but the definition of non-traditional defense contractor is the one that talks about is not subject to full CAS coverage. That does not mean that encompasses the nonprofit research institutions. That's a separate and distinct group. So you could, in theory, be a nonprofit research institution, I believe. Now I'm speculating here because this has never happened yet, and still have accepted CAS-covered contracts and still be okay and satisfy that requirement, because that requirement, that definition, is not the same for nonprofit research institutions as it is for non-traditional defense contractors. Does that make sense? So I think you can still be considered a nonprofit research institution and still have accepted CAS-compliant contracts. Because the definition is different. Now, as I said, that one has not been addressed yet. That is something that is new enough in the statute that, as far as I know, has not come up or been questioned yet, but that is an argument that I would certainly make and be comfortable with if we got to that point.
Okay. Does 1/3 cost share requirement continue through the life of the OT for prototype, including cost growths, or does the government have to fund cost growths if they want the project completed?
No, so the 1/3 cost share talks about the cost, 1/3 of the cost of the transaction, so that if the transaction grows, the third is going to grow with it. Now, what it does not cover, though, is the production end of things yet. We'll wait and see how that's going to work out later. So it's just the prototype agreement, but these agreements tend to have more work that's added onto them because SECA doesn't apply to them, and so it is often that you'll see additional tasks being put on them. But if you're with the cost sharing 1/3, it is a statutory requirement, and as the agreement value grows, your third is going to grow right along with it. So we have to maintain that 1/3, 2/3 throughout the prototype agreement life.
Right. You said early on in your briefing that we have to take the prototype into inventory at the end for an OT for prototype. Do you have to have a physical system prototype? It says, I thought 2371B applied to improvement of platform systems, components, or materials as well.
Yeah, you don't have to have a physical prototype. You can have a virtual prototype. It's becoming much more common. And you don't have to actually take the prototype into inventory, but your plan at the beginning should have been that you wanted to get a prototype at the end of this that you could take into inventory if you so desired. And that's the distinction from the research type, where the plan is never to take in the prototype because the idea is it's consumed in testing. So the prototype is going to be there. You can take it as a deliverable or not, depending on the circumstances. And let's be honest, some of these prototype agreements, I used to do a lot of experimental airplane programs as OTs. What often happens to experimental airplanes the first couple times you fly them? You may not have a prototype left over at the end. and that's okay. You may choose, the agency may choose or look at it at the end and think that is not what we were after at all, that we don't want it, we don't have any use for it, and do what they're going to do with it. So the agency can make that determination, but at the time the agreement is started, we need to look and see, is the plan that we have the option to take the prototype down the road, but there is no requirement that the prototype is actually delivered. So, and if it's a virtual prototype, then obviously it's never going to be delivered in the physical sense of the word. But what are we looking for to get as a deliverable or get into our possession at the end of the agreement?
Okay, well, we got time for one short question. So,
Okay.
Are there any disadvantages to asking for an OT?
As a contractor?
Yeah.
The only disadvantage may be is that if you have an agency that is not familiar with them, you may get a lot of pushback from the organization. Some organizations are much more conservative, much more risk adverse, which I find a little funny in the R&D world that you'd be risk adverse, but that may not feel comfortable with the idea of negotiating an agreement from scratch, that may not have the bandwidth or don't feel that they have the bandwidth to do one of these. And that would be the only disadvantage, is that if that's the only thing you wanted, then you may have an organization that doesn't want to necessarily work with you because of it. Most organizations in DoD right now are being pushed from the Pentagon on down to do more and more of these kind of innovative kind of arrangements. So I don't think there's necessarily a disadvantage to doing it now. But just be ready that if it's an agency that's never done one before, the process could be a little bit more plodding because they're learning as they're going while you're learning as you go too. And it just may take a little bit more time. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I'm going to stay here if anybody has any questions, but thanks for coming.